Good afternoon, and welcome to this special briefing exploring what's next for the U.S. and Iran. My name is Rana Graf Schneider, and I am the president of the board of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Cincinnati. Before we start, I'd like to say that if you are in need of closed captioning during this event, all you have to do is locate the closed caption button on the bottom of the Zoom navigation bar. To enable the captions, click on the Show Subtitles option in the list, and you should be able to get that information. It is, of course, no secret that we are living in turbulent and complex times. Today's briefing is consistent with the JCRC's commitment to you, our community, to play an educational role by bringing the best and the brightest thought leaders to illuminate and explore critical and challenging issues. What is happening in Israel right now is certainly one of those issues. We couldn't be more fortunate to have a true expert in the geopolitics of the region to walk us through what is happening on the ground and what may lie ahead. Today, we will be unpacking the Biden administration's approach to the Iran deal. And it's worth noting that the conflict between Israel and Hamas and the international community's approach to Iran are certainly not unrelated issues. The 2015 Iran nuclear agreement, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, continues to attract controversy and raise serious questions about global security. Since the initiation of the agreement under the President Barack Obama and the Trump administration's subsequent withdrawal from the deal, we've witnessed an expansion of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, numerous regional incidents that risk major conflict escalation, economic sanctions levied by Washington against Tehran, and the continuation of proxy wars throughout the region. President Joe Biden has said that the United States will return to the JCPOA if Iran resumes compliance. Meanwhile, we are witnessing the most violent escalation between Israel and Iranian-funded Hamas in years. After more than a week of more than 3,000 rocket attacks by Hamas and Israel's retaliatory strikes in Gaza. To help us make sense of these complex dynamics, it is my great honor to welcome a truly distinguished expert on the topic at hand today, Ambassador Dennis Ross. He is counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He also teaches at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization. And for more than 12 years, serving under 3 administrations, Republican and Democratic, Ambassador Ross has played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties in the U.S. as the U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Ambassador Ross is the author of 5 books on the peace process, the Middle East, and international relations. Most recently, his book is Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destinies, published just in 2019. Ambassador Ross will share his remarks, and then we hope to have time for questions, which you'll be able to enter using the Q&A function in Zoom. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Ambassador Ross. Thank you.
Well, that didn't feel virtual. Look, it's nice to be with you. I look forward to actually being with you in person at some point. Thank you for that nice introduction. This is obviously a time of enormous uncertainty in the Middle East. And I would say, you know, when we originally planned for me to do this briefing, as Rona was making clear, this was going to be just on where we are with Iran, what the Biden administration approach is going to be, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I also want us to address what's happening right now. I hadn't planned to say this, but there is news that a ceasefire is now imminent in Israel with Hamas. But it's pretty hard not to be disheartened by some of the reaction of this country to Israel and what's going on. And I want to start with that because I think one of our obligations is to be thinking about how do we frame this issue differently? How do we bring it into focus? How do we understand what's just happened? And how do we put it in a perspective or a context? And here I would say one point of departure for me is that in 2014, there was a conflict between Israel and Hamas that went on for 52 days. During those 52 days, Hamas fired 4,500 rockets into Israel. Here we are in 2021. There have been a couple of intervening exchanges of fire that went on for a day or at most two. But basically, in 2014, 4,500 rockets were fired over 52 days, and over the course of 10, just under that number have been fired by Hamas. Now, what that tells you is whatever was done to try to do some rebuilding, although conditions in Gaza remain obviously quite impoverished, but whatever was done to bring materials in to do rebuilding after 2014, when 3,000 buildings were actually either totally or partially destroyed, what was clear is that Hamas did two things with materials. One, they diverted them to building a very wide network of tunnels, which the Israelis referred to as the metro. Now, this metro isn't for the Palestinian public in Gaza. It is for weapons and for fighters and for the Hamas leaders. Now, what does it take to build this network of tunnels, more than 60 miles of tunnels underground? Well, it takes an awful lot of steel. It takes an enormous amount of cement. It takes a lot of electrical wiring. Basically, everything you would need if you were actually going to be rebuilding Gaza for the people who live there. But that was not Hamas's purpose. So that's sort of point one. Point two, when you hear about, look what Israel is doing to Gaza, well, really, we should start with what is Hamas doing to Gaza? And we should put it in perspective. Israel withdrew 100% in 2005, September of 2005 from Gaza. Now, some people will say, okay, Israel withdrew, but then they slapped a quarantine on it. So they control what goes in and out of Gaza. They did not put that quarantine on until 2007. Between 2005 and 2007, Hamas was there, but the PA was the operating authority within Gaza. Hamas carried out a coup against the PA. Even in this intervening period, they were engaging in attacks against Israel. Now, just to put this in perspective, when Israel withdrew in September of 2005, there was a process. It went from August to September. During that process, Hamas carried out a terror attack, bombing attack in Beersheba. There were 6 crossing points between Israel and Gaza, and they were used for different purposes, some purely for goods. You might have more than 1,000 trucks a day going back and forth. One was for people, one was for laborers. Hamas, during this period after Israel withdrew, over the course of the first 6 months, they carried out multiple attacks on the crossing points. Who would suffer from that? The crossing points weren't a favor to Israel. They were what kept Gaza connected to the outside world. And they carried out attacks on that. So those 6 crossing points were reduced to 2 to be able to provide more security for them. This was Hamas. So when we look at what's gone on and people's focus exclusively on Israel, it's important to keep in mind who Hamas is. They're an Islamist party. There are no civil or human rights within Gaza. God help you if you're gay. Hamas is essentially a Muslim Brotherhood party. and they have full control there. So as we think about this, we need to think about who Hamas is and how you keep a spotlight on Hamas. I've been saying over the last couple of days and written some articles now that basically make the point that in the aftermath with the ceasefire, I would like to see the Biden administration mobilize the world to create a massive reconstruction plan for Gaza to deal with the infrastructure. There's been 1,100 buildings that were destroyed now in the last 10 days. There's another 7,300 that have been partially damaged. There needs to be massive infrastructure work because the tunnels collapsed and destroyed streets, water pipes, and the like. But that massive reconstruction plan project, which should have, we should mobilize the Europeans, we should mobilize the Gulf states, we should make this an international approach. That massive plan needs to be conditioned on one issue: no Hamas rockets, a verifiable way of having them withdrawn. And the reason for that is, who is going to invest in infrastructure and construction in Gaza if Hamas retains its rockets and at a time of its choosing, it can do this all over again? And when they do it, Israel will respond and it will destroy that investment. This is a way to think about the issue. This is a way to frame the issue. I hope this is what the administration will do going forward. I know they're thinking about what can be done in terms of humanitarian relief and assistance that could go in there in some reconstruction. Whatever is done, I would like to frame it the way I'm describing, but whatever is done, there needs to be a mechanism that ensures that the material can't be diverted. And if Hamas begins to divert it, the delivery stops. The focus needs to be on Hamas. They need to be put on the defensive. The cost of them, what they're doing, needs to be heightened. Now, let me make one more comment on what happened and how this evolved and why it took place. And then I'm happy to talk a little bit about Iran and then turn over to your questions. As I think Rana knows, that I have the capacity to go on for long periods of time, not take a breath and not repeat myself. And if I do that, you won't ask any questions, it'll just be a monologue. So I will try to turn this into a dialogue, but let me make a few additional points and then leave time for you to raise whatever you want to raise. Hamas used what was happening in Jerusalem as an excuse to launch rockets against Jerusalem. By the way, 368,000 Palestinians live in East Jerusalem. When the rockets are fired towards there, if they hit, guess who gets killed? Palestinians. And when Israel responds to what they do, and Hamas knew they would respond, guess who gets killed in Gaza? Palestinians. So it's clear Hamas doesn't put the well-being of Palestinians first. But the issue of Jerusalem had been raised by a perfect storm of events. One was the legal process of potentially evicting several Palestinian families who have lived in the Sheikh Jarrah area since 1948. There is a legal question of ownership. It's a complicated issue. There is a right-wing settler group that had bought from a Jewish trust the deeds to these houses. The issue was going to the Israeli Supreme Court to resolve, to finalize. Lower courts had found in favor of the Jewish ownership and therefore for eviction. Two issues in Jerusalem will always trigger a great reaction, and that takes on a life of its own. One is if you're removing Palestinian presence, and two is if you're touching the holy sites, the Muslim holy sites. The third holiest sites in Islam, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is according to the faith, this is where Muhammad rose to heaven. So all this, Sheikh Jarrah, which became a cause célèbre, including by not just Palestinians rallying to support these families, but also by those on the Israeli right who chose to make it a big issue. And you had that issue, and then you had the issue of all this taking place during Ramadan, during the last days of Ramadan, which are especially intense from a religious standpoint. You had that coincide with Jerusalem Day, which commemorates the 67 war and the reunification of Jerusalem. Jerusalem Day involves large, tens of thousands of Israelis going into the Kotel. There were stones being thrown from the platform, where the mosques are is on the surface. There were stones being thrown from the platform over the side. The Israeli police then responded to that, and they did something that they probably shouldn't have done. It's one thing that the stones throwers were not in the mosque. They may have been assembling all sorts of stones there, but they were not in the mosque. You can't, the mosque is right next to where the plateau comes to an end, and the western wall is below it. It's connected to it, but below it. And if they were going to stop them from throwing the stones, they needed to do it on the plateau, not in the mosque. And they went into the mosque. They fired stun grenades in the mosque, tear gas into the mosque. And everybody's a reporter now, because everybody has a cell phone. And they turn on their video and they show these images, and they look like an Israeli assault on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You go back to the 1929, what led to the massacre in Hebron. It was the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haji Min al-Husseini, who put out a handbill that showed a Star of David over the Dome of the Rock. And this triggered what were, riots throughout all of the Holy Land. When you touch the mosque, you create an electric reaction. This is the one thing that brings Palestinians truly out. So this was not done in a way that was thought through the consequences. And Hamas chose to seize it, to make themselves the defender of Jerusalem, to seize it on the mantle of leadership, to assume the mantle of leadership away from Mahmoud Abbas. And then they set in motion what has happened by firing 7 rockets, knowing that Israel would respond. So what's required, I just wrote a piece where I said, look, Israel was, both in terms of the legal issue, is technically right. And even in terms of having to stop those throwing rocks, absolutely have to do it. But your responses need not just to have you in the right, they need to be wise. And these were not moves that were wise. And they've helped to divert attention away from who is the real culprit here, which is Hamas. And we have to bring that back into focus. Okay, so what's my natural way of linking this to the Iranians? So during the course last 10 days, Hamas tried, in addition to the rockets they fired, they sent drones. They were trying to send drones with explosives into Israel, which Israel shot down. And who provided the drones? The Iranians provided the drones. Who provided the materials for the rockets? The Iranians provided the materials for the rockets. Who trained Hamas in terms of how to build and manufacture and assemble the rockets? The Iranians did that. The Quds Force did that. So the Iran role in the region is the consistent one of basically trying to create pressures on first of all, against Israel, but on every Arab regime. And every place where Iran is, with Shia militias, you either have a failing state or a failed state or a state in paralysis. Iran offers nothing except, in a sense, more impoverishment, much like Hamas. Now, when they did the JCPOA originally, they increased the amount of support they were providing to Hezbollah. The Biden administration is not like the Obama administration in the following sense. When the Obama administration did the JCPOA, there was such concern in the administration that the Iranians wouldn't implement the deal after it was agreed that we turned a blind eye to what they were doing to the region. We did very little about that. The Biden approach seems to be, we will take a page from the Iranians. We'll separate the nuclear file from what is going on in the region. If they're where they threaten in the region, we will work with our partners to counter them. We will not give them a blank check to do whatever they want. And I believe this is what the administration has been telling the Israelis, who they pretty much have given, total support for what Israel has been doing in terms of carrying out attacks into Syria, to blunt what the Iranians are trying to do in terms of a precision-guided project. But they've been saying the same thing to the Saudis and the Emiratis. And we'll see how that is carried out in practice. I mean, it's one thing to say it, it's going to be something else to practically provide the support. Well, what about the JCPOA? What about getting back into compliance for compliance, which is the position the Biden administration has adopted? The position of the administration was compliance for compliance means Iran first has to come back into compliance before we meet our obligations. Our obligations are to lift the sanctions, the nuclear-related sanctions, not all sanctions, not the terrorism sanctions, not the human rights sanctions, but the nuclear-related sanctions. In the negotiations that have resumed, which are not direct or indirect, in Vienna, the Europeans, the Russian, Chinese act as a go-between between us and the Iranians. The Iranian position was the U.S. walked away from JCPOA. We didn't. We waited a year before we began to act, and we did so. It's up to the U.S. to act first, not us to act first. The administration's position is no. We'll do it in tandem with you. We'll do it. We can create a sequence of simultaneity, but you have to move, we have to move, we both have to move. So we have to lift sanctions, but you have to come back into compliance. And what does that mean? It means several things. The Iranians have accumulated several bombs worth of low enriched material. Now, according to JCPOA, they are only supposed to have 300 kilograms of low enriched uranium at any one time. And right now they have about 12 times that amount. They're supposed to limit the level of their enrichment, meaning the purification of the uranium, to 3.67%. Not only are they enriching now to 20%, but they have actually begun enrichment to 60%, which is extremely close to weapons grade. They have installed advanced centrifuges that are dramatically more efficient than the centrifuges that they used before. And understand what a centrifuge is. A centrifuge is what spins hexafluoride, which is a uranium gas. And it separates out the fissile material, it separates out minute amounts. It spins at about 700 miles an hour. These are very delicate machines. This is what produces the low enriched uranium, or what could produce the high enriched uranium. 20% enrichment is the dividing point between low enriched uranium and high enriched uranium. So they're enriching not only to 20%, now they've begun enriching to 60%. And that, it takes you a week to go from 60% to 90%, which is weapons grade. So, the advanced cascades, basically they weren't permitted under the terms of the deal to install them until the year 2025. The R&D for that, they weren't permitted to do again until 2025. So all this has been advanced by 4 to 5 years. So when we go back into the JCPOA and we lift our nuclear related sanctions, they go back, they can do many things. The knowledge they've acquired, they can't reverse. And the advanced centrifuges, they're saying they don't want to dismantle, they just want to unplug. So at this point, there are, according to the Iranians, a lot of progress has been made. According to the EU officials last night, they too think that an agreement is possible very soon. That's not what the administration is saying, not because I think they're not being forthcoming, but because they're not sure. And the reason still is that the Iranians are asking us to go beyond the sanctions we're required to lift according to our obligations, and provide more sanctions relief, in part because the Trump administration designated an additional 1,500 individuals and entities. And they're saying these go well beyond what were the sanctions that existed prior to doing the JCPOA. So there is still some discussion on that, but look, a lot depends upon whether the Iranians are so driven by the need for sanctions relief that they want to get it sooner rather than later. I would just say one thing to put this in perspective. There were those who said, I'm sure you recall, a couple of weeks ago, there was an explosion at Natanz, which is the largest enrichment site for the Iranians. Actually, there's been two in one a few weeks ago and one 6 months ago. It is assumed that it's the Israelis who were responsible for the sabotage. There were those who immediately came out and said, oh, here was Israel trying to subvert the negotiations, Now Iran has an excuse to walk away from the negotiations. And Iranians didn't walk away, and the answer is pretty clear, because they want sanctions relief. And those who criticize the idea of going back in the JCPOA fear that we will give up all our leverage that comes from the sanctions that have been imposed, including all the additional ones that were imposed by the Trump administration. The problem is that the Iranians have accelerated their nuclear program. And as of tomorrow, they're saying that if they don't have sanctions relief, they will no longer allow the IAEA to be monitoring. Now, what the EU was putting out last night is that progress is being made, and they expect that this temporary agreement with the IAEA will be extended. We'll see. I'm not sure. I am certain that we will be back in the JCPOA sometime this year. If not before the Iranian election, which is on June 18th, then sometime after there's a new Iranian president, which will be in August, I would say by September. I am convinced of that because Iran wants the sanctions relief. The timing will be determined by how anxious they are to get that sanctions relief. They're saying they're patient. The reality will tell us one way or the other. Now, the critical issue, as I mentioned, for those who've raised questions about going back in is what happens to your leverage? Once you've lifted the sanctions, even if it's not all the sanctions, what incentive do the Iranians have to negotiate a follow-on agreement? The administration says two things. A, that in the Vienna talks, they're asking for more than what is required now. And B, that if we don't have an agreement within, say, 18 to 24 months, we can always go back and reimpose all the sanctions again. And that's a possibility, although that has very little to do with what the Iranians do in the region. My own take is that we need to have a political pressure approach, as well as an economic pressure approach, as well as a military one. The Iranians need to understand, if we want to get a follow-on agreement, they need to understand we will never allow them to be a threshold nuclear weapon state, one. Two, that we will engage in a good faith diplomatic effort, good faith negotiations to achieve that. But if they're not prepared to negotiate a follow-on agreement, we will do whatever it takes. We will exercise whatever option is necessary, whatever means is necessary to ensure that they will not become a threshold nuclear weapon state. If that means, not just covert action, but overt military action to destroy their nuclear infrastructure, they should understand that's their position. We should convey it in private. We should also say it in public, so the world gets used to the idea. We should provide the Israelis the massive ordnance penetrator. This was a non-nuclear conventional weapon, 30,000-pound bomb that was developed during the Obama administration, so that President Obama said all options were on the table. He told us early in the administration, if diplomacy doesn't work, don't come back and tell me we don't have a military option. One of the enrichment sites for the Iranians is built into a mountain. And when you hear bunker buster bombs, those can't affect the mountain. It either takes a nuclear weapon to do it, or it takes a non-nuclear weapon, a massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound bomb that its fuse only ignites after it penetrates deep underground. The Fordo site built into a mountain, Israel can't destroy. So I'd say provide them the massive ordnance penetrator, release them the B-2 bomber. And the reason for doing this is maybe the Iranians won't believe our threats, but they would believe the Israeli ones. The Iranians have to know they put their nuclear infrastructure at risk if they're not prepared to negotiate a follow-on agreement. That is important. We need to prepare the ground for that. The economic pressure is important. Isolating the Iranians and not ourselves politically is important. The problem with the Trump administration, among other things, was they isolated us. They didn't isolate the Iranians. The Iranians don't see themselves as North Korea. So isolating them politically matters. So let me wrap this up by saying, I think we will be back in the JCPOA. Much will depend upon how the administration acts to retain our leverage. And it will require us to be very active in terms of what we do with our partners in the region to counteract what the Iranians are doing. Now, the administration, my last word is this, the administration doesn't want to make the Middle East a priority. And what we've just seen is, as I've said to a number of the president's secretary of states I work for, when they said, look, they really wanted to act elsewhere, I said, that's fine, but understand, you may ignore the Middle East, but the Middle East will not ignore you. Why don't I pause there? Rona, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much for illuminating insights into all of these current crises. And you have been kind enough to say that you'll take questions. So we have a number of them in the chat right now that I will give to you. The first question is about the so-called Marshall Plan for Gaza, as the questioner describes it. Give up the rockets in exchange for aid to rebuild. Can you give more details on what you think that should look like?
Well, it has to be sequenced in any event because you've got to be able to satisfy, we have to satisfy ourselves that the rockets are withdrawn and the rocket production facilities have not been rebuilt. The good news is the rocket production facilities have been destroyed. The bad news is they will go ahead and rebuild them unless there's a mechanism to prevent that kind of rebuilding. But I'm focused on this from two standpoints. One is just the public framing of it, to make the issue the rockets. The other is the practicality of who puts together this kind of Marshall Plan. Again, recognize you're talking about a small area, 2.3 million people. So this is a manageable project in terms of what could be invested. Construction is a major industry in Gaza, so it'll be a source of employment. It would certainly build the stake of Palestinians in Gaza not to see this destroyed by Hamas acting. But what I have in mind is a practical approach that we would organize in terms of mobilizing the resources, creating a division of labor of who would fund which projects, projects that would be divided between infrastructure and building of housing, restoration of buildings. That's what I have in mind, and you'd have to have a mechanism that allows you to monitor what Hamas is doing and make sure they're not cheating, and that the rockets both have been either withdrawn or have been destroyed, and there's no rebuilding going on of rockets.
Thank you. The second question is, how have the newly friendly Arab countries responded to recent events, and will this step back that progress?
Well, it certainly has put a damper on it. They have, the Jerusalem's an issue for everybody. So when these images of the Mosques being under assault, were circulating throughout the region, and they went viral very quickly. It produced condemnations from the states that have made peace with Israel. Now, you've had in the past, Egypt and Jordan stick to their peace treaties even when they were low points in the relationship. And it was very clear, the UAE made it clear they're not walking away from the agreement, but they were very critical of what Israel had done. The UAE, I will say, has been by far the most balanced. They've talked about the loss of life on both sides. They've talked about the need to stop the suffering on both sides. They've singled out the Israelis for what they did in Jerusalem. But they're holding a line on the agreement, but obviously you're not seeing an acceleration of the process between these states. And it doesn't mean that there can't be building after there's a calm. There should be. We should have two different tracks. One track should be what you do to reconstruct in Gaza, but based on the condition I said. And then what you do to try to break the stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians by taking advantage of the normalization process to try to add to the states that would engage in outreach to Israel. For example, let's say the Saudis, you wanted the Saudis to do public outreach towards Israel, and they would ask for something from the Israelis in return as it relates to the Palestinians. The model for that was created by the UAE because they came to the Trump administration and said, we'll give you a win. You can produce the first peace treaty since 1994 between an Arab state and Israel, but there can't be any annexation. And we have certain security needs. We want certain weapons sold to us that haven't, because we're not at peace with Israel, you haven't sold. So I could see going to the Saudis and saying, you know, the Emiratis made it clear that they would do full normalization in return for no annexation of the territory allotted to Israel under the Trump plan. If you don't want to do full normalization, what about taking a partial step? In the 1990s, we had liaison offices in 5 different Arab states with Israel. What if Saudi Arabia were prepared to establish a commercial trade office in Tel Aviv? Maybe they would ask for Israel to stop building in the area to the east of the security barrier. The security barrier is on 8% of the West Bank, the territory closest to the Green Line, meaning on 92% of the area you wouldn't be building. You know, when the Israeli public was given the choice of annexation or normalization, 80% favored normalization over annexation. You know, 80% of the Israelis can't believe on whether it's day or night. So the fact that 80% were prepared to agree to this tells you if you have something significant from the Arabs, it'll justify certain steps towards the Palestinians. And we could broker this, but also you do this privately and you go to the Palestinians and you require something from them as well. That's what I'd like to see the Biden administration do. And when it says it wants to build on the normalization process, that would be an important thing to do. We need to get beyond where we are. We need to see some calm. You need to be working on Gaza at the same time. You might even, I want those who are committing to Gaza, I want them to also be the Gulf Arab states. But they won't do it if they think that Hamas is going to benefit. So we have to strike the balance the way I've been describing it.
Thank you. Next question is, to what extent is the Israeli response a message and a warning to Hezbollah and ultimately Iran?
It's a very good question. I do think some of what the Israelis did in Gaza this time was a message absolutely to Hezbollah, not Iran, but to Hezbollah. Indirectly to Iran, because Hezbollah will get the message and make it clear to Iran, you can see what they would do to us, the means they have. Much of what the Hezbollah has done has also been to build tunnels and so forth. So yeah, they're showcasing what they can do as a lesson, as a message as well. Now Iran, the Hezbollah knows it would be different because they have so many more rockets. Israel would be hit with at least 2,000 rockets a day in a war with Hezbollah. Israel would have to go in on the ground because in the end it couldn't succeed without going in on the ground. You'll end up destroying much of Lebanon in the process. It would be very costly, terrible. Hezbollah understands how costly it would be for them, but it would obviously be costly for Israel. If Israel's being hit with 2,000 rockets a day, they could go on for about a month. So there's a kind of mutual deterrence that's there, but the questioner is right that there is some message sending that's been going on with the kind of attacks the Israelis have been carrying out in Gaza. But also note something yesterday, there were 7 rockets fired from Lebanon into Israel. Now they were fired by Palestinian groups, not Hezbollah, but they were fired from an area that Hezbollah completely controls. So Hezbollah was signaling that they might, that they were stretching the bounds that had been respected on their side.
Thank you. Next question is, speaking of leverage, what leverage do we have on China to keep them from undermining our efforts to contain Iran?
Well, obviously the relationship with China is caught up in a much bigger competition. So we have to think about it, not only how do we want to affect their behavior on Iran, but when we affect their behavior on Iran, where will they come back and press us? Anyway, that I think this is it's not a simple proposition, but I will say in the last couple of months, the Iranians were able to sell more oil, and it was clear they were doing it indirectly to the Chinese. In the most current month, that stopped. So it suggests that maybe there has been some quiet conversations we've had with the Chinese. While we're obviously in a competitive relationship, we're probably also looking for those areas where we have common interests. And ironically, the Chinese have no interest in Iran having a nuclear weapon, and they really don't have an interest in Iran destabilizing the region. So there is some room for cooperation there.
From a negotiations standpoint, what should the U.S. do to revitalize the peace process? Israel is in political turmoil, the PA is rudderless, and Hamas is Hamas. Whatever momentum the Abraham Accords has generated has dissipated. Is this a job for those regional partners, or is there no point at this time? If you were the envoy, what would you advise?
Well, I kind of gave the answer before. I would try to build on the Abraham Accords to actually draw those states like the UAE into support for what's going to be done in Gaza, so that it's not being done by Qatar. Al Jazeera basically is broadcasting incitement nonstop. That's out of Qatar. I think the approach to Gaza, where it's been basically Qatar that pays them $300 million a month, I think you want to replace that, number one. But parallel to that is what I said. The UAE created a model. They created a relationship between their readiness to normalize completely with Israel and Israel not taking a step of annexation. So you can create gradations there. I gave the example of, I would try to broker something with Saudis. I would give the Saudis a menu of choices. I would be going to the same menu with the Israelis. I'd see what the two of them could agree to in terms of the step that Saudi Arabia would take towards Israel and what Israel could then take towards the Palestinians. I would keep that all as a private understanding until I'd gone to the Palestinians, and I would then say, okay, here's what we can get Israel. We believe we can get Israel to stop building outside the blocks, but we have to have something from you. We are not going to be in a situation where you get to receive and you don't have to do anything. So I would press them to take, for the first time publicly acknowledge the historic Jewish connection to the land. Psychologically, this would have a big effect on Israelis. So I would broker what would amount to three-way understandings. And it's the normalization process that creates a new possibility. If you were to push for direct negotiations right now between Israelis and Palestinians, they would go nowhere. The questioner was right. The politics on each side make it impossible. The psychology and the substantive gaps makes it impossible. They will talk past each other. But there's a new angle. Arab states have an interest in normalizing with Israel because they see not just in the security area, they see what they can gain in the high-tech area, in the startup area, in the health area, in terms of food security, in terms of water security. So I would take advantage of that by trying to broker these kinds of understandings. This creates one new opening, and the only one I see that allows you to do something between the Israelis and the Palestinians. What we saw this week is that you can't wish away the Palestinians. They're there. So you have to have a strategy for it. We'll see. Israel politics makes that difficult right now, but it'll be very interesting to see because of the internal stresses we saw in Israel. What we saw this week in terms of the intercommunal violence, we've never seen before. Even at the beginning of the Second Intifada, it didn't compare to what we just saw. You have to literally go back to like the 1936 to 1939 period to see anything like what we saw in Lod, Ramla, parts of Haifa, in the northern part of the country, in the Galilee. This is a reminder to the Israeli government. They have a lot of repair work to do internally in terms of outreach. They should be drawing together all the mayors of the Arab cities and towns. There should be a summit with them. They should focus on what needs to be done right now. The vast majority of Israeli Arabs define themselves as being Israeli citizens and happy to be Israelis. What you had is about 10% who were radicalized, who were responsible for what we saw, and then you saw right-wing thugs on the Israeli side, this group called Lahava, that that went in, and you basically had a competition in terms of violence. That has to end.
So the next question really kind of comes off, I think, with the beginning remarks you made in terms of Hamas. But the question is, why do you think Hamas would give up its goal of destroying Israel for the sake of the well-being of its people, especially considering that Hamas was winning the election with its positioning of destroying Israel?
Well, they weren't winning the election because of that. They're winning the election because of the PA's corruption and mismanagement. And by the way, if there had been free and fair elections in Gaza, they would have lost. They would win in the West Bank. Wherever the authority is, the Palestinian publics are alienated. Now they've succeeded in making themselves a defender of Jerusalem. But when this is all over and everybody looks at, oh, look at the condition of Gaza. And by the way, nothing will have changed in Jerusalem. Not at all clear that that'll be the case. It's not that I think that they're going to give up their rockets so easily, but you have to put them on the defensive. You have to shift the focus. The focus right now is on what Israel's done to the Palestinians, not what Hamas has done to Israel and Palestinians. Good statecraft begins by framing the issues in a way that everybody relates to and responds to. We have to reframe these issues, and that's why I want to suggest what I'm suggesting, and I want to put Hamas on the defensive. We may not succeed. They may make some limited concessions. In return for limited concessions, they get limited reconstruction. But even that limited reconstruction will create some stake for them in not immediately breaking what will be ceasefire. Look, many in the Israeli military are saying, all right, well, we're buying 5 years. Well, okay, what can you do to try to cement that a little bit more?
Moving forward, what should Europe's role be in the Iranian nuclear question? What should be the U.S. role, and what should the U.S. do to rebuild this partnership in this area?
With the Europeans?
Well, the question doesn't make that clear. So I think probably they're asking both in terms of the relationship with Europe and with regard to Europe and the Middle East.
Look, I think the Biden administration has moved pretty quickly to restore our alliances, to restore a common position with the Europeans. Now, you can use that as a form of leverage for us with the Europeans too. I mean, I would like to see the administration not only align itself as it has in the negotiations on the nuclear issue, but bring the Europeans in to be supportive of us in terms of supporting our friends and partners who are being threatened by the Iranians. This should not just be us with our partners in the region, it should be the Europeans as well. And the Europeans will say they want to see Iran's ballistic missiles curbed. They'll say that they're against what Iran is doing in terms of destabilization. But let's work together to actually translate words into actions.
Okay. The next one is, did I hear correctly that there was a tacit understanding when the JCPOA was signed that the Obama administration would not push hard against Iran's regional activities, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Gaza?
No, you didn't hear a tacit understanding. There was not a tacit understanding. There was a fear that Iran would not implement the deal, and therefore the administration became very hesitant in the region. It was perceived by the regional actors, Israel and the Arab states, that the administration was turning a blind eye to it. It was not they were turning a blind eye. It's not that there was an understanding, but there was a concern. It was a misplaced concern. I would tell them after I left the administration, I would tell them, because I left in 2011, well before this, but I would tell the people I knew, Iran's not looking for an excuse not to implement. They want the sanctions relief. If they stop implementing, the sanctions snap back. That was one of the agreements, one of the things that was worked out, the snapback provision. So they're not looking for an excuse, but that's how it was perceived by the administration.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, given the social media environment, what can we do to counter falsehoods about Israel?
Well, there's no simple answer to this. I think you just have to keep repeating, what the reality is. That's why I started off by talking about, let's make a mantra. Israel withdrew in 2005. When it withdrew, it was supposed to be at least for land for, if not for land for peace, at least land for security. You got land for rockets. You got land for tunnels. Let's keep repeating that. If the argument is made, but they put this quarantine on. They didn't put the quarantine on until 2007. They withdrew in 2005. Hamas, look at how Hamas has built up. While Gaza remains impoverished, look how Hamas invests not in building construction above ground, but in building tunnels for their arsenal and their fighters underground. Let's create the contrast. All you can do is kind of make these points and keep repeating them. There's no simple answer to social media because it takes on a life of its own and it empowers everybody. So you have to answer it on social media.
And thank you. And I'm going to take advantage of the bully pulpit here and ask the final question, which is, in view of all your observations, and particularly, I think your wise emphasis on this kind of private negotiations between the parties, do you think there is any possibility in the near future for a two-state solution? And is that something that we should be working towards in any way, privately or publicly, particularly considering the latest statistics on both sides are pretty close to not supportive of that. Even on the Palestinian side, there is not overwhelming support for a two-state solution, but for a one-state solution.
The short answer is we can't give up on it, but we have to be realistic. There is no two-state solution or outcome anytime soon. First of all, there's the politics in Israel preclude it, and the politics among the Palestinians preclude it. So what we have to do is we have to preserve it as an option, because if you lose it as an option, then the only outcome is one state. And one state means a binational state. That's the end of Zionism. You can have a Jewish state, but it won't be democratic, or you have a democratic state, but it won't be Jewish. Either way, that's the end of Zionism. Zionism was about Jewish democracy. So, when Ben Gurion said in 48, after the war, he said, look, we could have taken the land to the Jordan River. We could have done that. But then we would have been a minority in our own state. So, the point is, how do you preserve the option? And I gave you a pathway to doing that by using use the Arab states as outreach. This is what the focus should be on right now, or at least after you, as I said, one track on Gaza, another track on building a normalization and outreach.
Well, Ambassador Ross, our deepest gratitude to you for taking time to share your wisdom and perspective with us on these obviously challenging topics that aren't going away anytime soon. And hence we have you back in person in October. We're very happy to hopefully welcome you in person when you'll be joining us again as part of our JCR speaker series for democracy by looking at Israel and the US. I want to also announce that there will be a list of resources that will be given by the Federation and JCRC in compiling these resources online as events unfold. And finally, I want to remind everyone that we are having our annual meeting, which will still be over Zoom. And that is June 29th at 7 p.m. So please come and register. Our guest speakers will be Robbie Kaplan and Amy Spitalnik of Integrity First for America. That is the firm litigating the landmark Charlottesville lawsuit. And they will sit down for a conversation about white supremacy in 2021 and their efforts to put violent extremists on trial. Many thanks to all of you for spending our lunchtime with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And especially thank you again to Ambassador Ross. Have a good day.